Hello, everyone. That's better. Hello. Good afternoon and welcome to you all. A very warm welcome to those of you here in the room and online. And we are very delighted that you are here to join in our round table discussion on criminology and criminal justice through the lens of queer theory. My name is Caroline Lansky, and I am the director of the Justice and Society Research Centre at the Institute of Criminology, which is jointly hosting this event with the law faculty at the University of Cambridge. I would like first to introduce you to our co-organisers of the event, my colleagues at the Justice and Society Research Centre, Arushi Garg, Rain Patiki, and Lena Holzer from the law faculty, all of whom will be taking over from me shortly. This event has been made possible as a result of support from many quarters. We would like to thank the financial support from the British Society of Criminology, the Society for Legal Studies, and Wolfson and Newnham Colleges at Cambridge. I would also like to thank some of the others who have helped us with the funding applications and other aspects of the organisations behind the scenes. These are Jane Dominy, Joy Magomba, Liv Hambridge, Jadeep Singh Lati, Vincius Fortes de Barros, Monica, Mark and Mark Yin. We are also grateful to the British Sign Language interpreters who have joined us today, Kirsty and Rachel. A few administrative things before I hand over to Rain for the interesting stuff. The toilets are outside in the corridor. If you go out of this door, it's to the right. If you go out of the other door, it's to the left. If in case of a fire, we will walk along this corridor and head out through a door on the left into the gardens. But I anticipate that won't be happening. In a moment, as I said, I will hand over to Rain, who is going to introduce us to the topic of the day, and then we will move on to the roundtable discussion with our speakers. This is the one and only part of the event that will be recorded. We will have a short break around 3:45, around 3:30 to 4:45. Thank you, Arishi. And then after that, we will have an opportunity for a Q&A discussion. So please think up some questions for that session afterwards. And for those of you online, I shall be monitoring the Q&A in the chat there. So please do log your questions there. We will finish the sort of formalities of the formal session around 4:30, after which there will be a drinks reception at the back. This will be an opportunity for us to continue our conversations informally. So please do stay on and join us for that if you can. Right, thank you. That's all from me. I shall hand over to Rain.
All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Rain. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm a second-year PhD student here at Criminology here at Newnham. So the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, and Transphobia, Ida Hobbit, is the anniversary of the WHO removing homosexuality from the classification of diseases on the 17th of May in 1990. So the first event was hosted in 2005, and the focus was just homophobia, but now the event is known essentially as the Day Against LGBTQIA Discrimination. So the theme for this year, 2025, is the power of communities, and the goal is to highlight and strengthen the resilience that emerges from our collective solidarity. And we do need a tremendous amount of strength and resilience given how things are right now. So only since we started to, organize this event, several things have happened. Trump, of course, have signed several executive orders that threaten the safety and deny the existence of our queer and trans siblings in the US. The UK Supreme Court has ruled that the terms woman and sex refer to biological woman and biological sex. In Hungary, where I am originally from, there has been a constitutional amendment that has been passed which bans all Pride events and authorizes the police to use facial recognition software to identify the attendees and to fine them. So this law restricting the freedom of assembly refers to a law from 2021, which protects children from being exposed to materials that portray divergence from self-identity corresponding to sex at birth, sex change, or homosexuality. So when we started to organize this event, I essentially wanted to do this introduction just in case some people in the audience are not quite aware of queer and trans issues. But now it seems that it's essentially impossible to be unaware of our struggles. So rather than throwing more depressing factoids at you, I want to talk to you about queerness in the context of hope, utopia, and the collective. So my PhD is a theoretical project on the fruitful interaction between utopian social theory and abolition. And this was not my original topic, but I am really, really glad that it found me, because this means that now I get to think about radical, revolutionary social change and read about it every day. So in the summer of 2023, I found myself drawn to the term utopia without really knowing why. And I finally understood it when I started reading Cruising Utopia by José Esteban Munoz, which, by the way, is the single most uplifting piece of academic writing that I've ever read, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. So Munoz essentially argues that the utopian rejection of pragmatism is associated with failure. So essentially, utopianism represents a failure to be normal. So the utopian imaginary resonates with queerness, blackness, brownness, and other minoritarian identities because they all entail a certain failure to be normal, an unwillingness or an inability to submit to the pragmatic dictates of majoritarian being. So basically, queerness is utopian, and there is something queer about everything that's utopian. So while this explains why I felt drawn to the term utopia, I want to have a bit of a closer look at this kinship between utopia and queerness, because it will help us understand how they can shape how we look at the world and how we set out to change it. So essentially, Munoz frames queerness as that thing that lets us feel that this world is not enough. So the same goes for utopia. So essentially, this involves a rejection of the present and an insistence on the possibility of another way of being, another world. So the effective structures that underlie this are essentially desire and hope. So desire and hope for something more, for something better, for something other. Munoz is drawing on the German utopian thinker Ernst Bloch, and he uses hope as both a critical effect and a methodology. So essentially, the present not being enough can be used to resist both the status quo and the idea that the future will simply be a continuation of the same. So by describing another way of being, a collective futurity that draws on moments from the past and images of the future, we can create a grounded critique of the present. So maybe at this point, you're thinking that this is a bit too idealistic and naive, which are two of the main words that describe utopia in mainstream media. But actually, Munoz is calling for a return of critical idealism in the sense that rationalism isn't quite dismissed, but it is unyoked from the politics of the pragmatic and reignited with an effective spark of idealism. So this is essentially a response to the anti-utopian present, where the critical imagination is denounced and suppressed by using ideas like, this is as good as things can be, or we have reached the end of history. Familiar notions. So essentially, we need the anticipatory and the imaginative powers of utopia and queerness in order to displace the disabling political pessimism of the present. So it is important to emphasize that here, talking about the rekindling of radical political imagination doesn't necessarily mean escapism or surrendering the present, giving up. It can just take the shape of a firm refusal of the dominant order and fuel political transformation. So this idealist orientation centered on hope doesn't mean ignoring negativity. It is impossible to think about and to talk about queerness, queer world making, and queer survival without negativity at the moment. So the negative sentiments can be used as a source of queer utopianism by negation. So essentially, we are talking about a determined negation of the negation that can create new modes of collectivity. And here I want to talk a bit more about disappointment, because we can't quite talk about the current queer experience without talking about disappointment. So drawing on Bloch, we can say that disappointment is a precondition for new hope. So disappointment pushes the subject to interrogate their hope, testing its content. If the test fails, be that because of the real world context or because of the content of the hope, the subject is faced with fresh possibilities because the disappointment doesn't break the attachment to the hoped for object. So essentially, the experience of disappointment inspires a process of excavation where as much as possible from the old is retained in the new. So recovering elements from the failed dream into a new hope means that a gold-bearing rubble can be rescued from the wreckage of history. So I want to look a little bit at the future now. And I actually want to question whether we want to make this distinction between the future and the present as if they really exist in this rigid binary. So maybe the future can already be found in the present, an actually existing queer reality, sort of a kernel of political possibility. We can see this in mutual aid networks, in queer gatherings, for example. Hopefully, you are familiar with the feeling of walking into a protest or even a big queer party and just feeling the masses of diverse and apologetic bodies that radiates power and potential. So we care for each other, and queer joy persists in the face of everything. So it is crucial for us to understand and embrace the power of our masses. And here, of course, we need to say that queerness isn't just white, middle class, able-bodied, young, etc. The collective futurity that queerness and utopia imply is an experience of being in common in difference, a map of life where singularities flow into the common, enacting a necessary communism. So with this intersectional vision of queer futurity in mind, let us draw on queerness to critique what is and build what can be. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Rain. So I will take over now. My name is Lena Holzer. I am an assistant professor in gender, race, and the law at the law faculty here. And I will be guiding us through the next part of our roundtable with our three speakers. So I will introduce them in order of seating. We have Aube Toulouse next to me. Aube has several impressive degrees, including also an MPhil in criminology from the University of Cambridge here. They did a PhD at the University of Lund, and their PhD thesis is titled Queer Intimacies, Rethinking Epistemology of Conducting Research with jihadist group members. So the research really looks at the experiences of French jihadists in their romantic relationships during their journey joining violent social movements. Their work is highly interdisciplinary, drawing on social psychology, cultural criminology, phenomenology, feminist and critical race scholarship, and the broad tradition of ethnographic inquiries. Next to Aube, we have S.M. Rodriguez, who is assistant professor of gender rights and human rights at the London School of Economics. Their research advances understandings of the impact of racialization, criminalization, ableism, and the imposition of gendered and sexual control of people of African descent. In their first monograph, The Economics of Queer Inclusion, they analyze the effects of transnational advocacy and transnational financing of anti-gay ideologies, specifically in the context of Uganda. And at the moment, they're working on several projects, including research on the intersection of anti-slavery, anti-imperialism, and anti-violence movements. And in addition to the research, they have also fostered knowledge production networks. For example, the Black queer movements, which brings together LGBTI activists of African descent, and as well also the Black Professors Pipeline in the UK. Next to SM, we have Sharon Cohen. Sharon is Professor of Feminist and Queer Legal Studies at the Law School of the University of Edinburgh. She has several projects and has researched several issues in the field of feminist and queer studies. At the moment, she co-leads an empirical project examining how women asylum claimants whose applications are based on a claim of rape are treated by tribunals. She's also co-editor of the Scottish Feminist Judgment Project and works on a comparative socio-legal project on the impact of law on the lives of trans persons. So this was the introduction, and I hope that the speaker can also introduce and add anything to what I've just said. The idea of the roundtable today is really to have an interdisciplinary conversation on what we can draw from, what we can learn from queer theory or the concept of queerness, queer-bodied, queer lives for understanding criminology and criminal justice. So I will start asking you a few questions, and you just tell us what you think about them. I would be interested in hearing what you are currently working on. So what are the kind of topics which interest you at the moment in relation to our roundtable today? Maybe we can start with Sharon. You can go the way up there.
Can people hear me? Thank you. Thanks, Lena, and thank you, Rushi, as well, for organising us and Rain and the other folk who are involved in organising and inviting us here today on this. I don't know how to pronounce the acronym, but the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia and Transphobia. I've been working on queer theory and law since I did my PhD, but I've been interested in these issues for even longer than that. But I got my PhD in 2001, and then since then I've been coming back to issues of gender, sexuality and law all the way through my career. And it's now sort of falls into two main areas that I work on. The first area is sexualized and gender-based violence, mostly against women because that's the prevalence according to the statistics that we have available to us, although it's by no means the full picture. And the second area is LGBTQ equality and rights. And both areas I've worked empirically, like the project about asylum and the project I did with trans folk in Scotland, asking them about how they experienced law in their everyday lives. But I've also done theoretical work looking at how feminist theory and queer theories have travelled alongside each other, sometimes as companions, sometimes as deadly enemies, and how to make sense of that, I guess. At the moment, I'm working on. I just finished a project last year, working for the Scottish Government on what happens to complainers. We call them complainers in Scotland, not complainants, as they use the term here. Complainers in rape trials, what happens to evidence about their character and their sexual history when they claim rape in the Scottish criminal justice system. It took a long time to do it because we started it just before COVID. And there was no surprise in what we found, which was that although the rules on paper are pretty good, the law in action, as we call it in the socio-legal field, is such that people will try to find their way around the rules in order to be able to enter the evidence that they would like to enter into the trial. I have very strong ambivalences about that project because, as we'll know from what's going to be talked about today, and even the title of the event, is that there's a strong theoretical, pragmatic, political pull towards abolition at the moment. That's very, it's not new, but it's very present. And trying to do a project where you're attempting to make things better for the complainers in the criminal justice system also feels like a project that's maintaining the criminal justice system. So I had some split personality moments around that. And then the other thing I'm working on is I've been working on trans people's equality for a long time, but recently I'm also having a moment of existential crisis because I like to not think of myself as a lawyer in any way. But I've got dragged into becoming a little bit of an employment lawyer, a little bit of an equality lawyer, because I've been looking at the cases that have been happening, particularly in Scotland, but elsewhere in the UK, around trans people's rights. So I found myself becoming more of a legal scholar probably at this moment in my life than I ever have been. And sometimes in those moments there's less space for theory, but hopefully in the conversation today we can talk about how you can find space for theory and theoretical, what work theory can do for you even when you're doing what feels like a very pragmatic rights-based project. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to echo the thank you so much for organizing this and for thinking to invite me. So I'll say in terms of the political moment that we're living in, we are witnessing these kind of intensified efforts to weaponize criminal law, specifically to control surplus populations, and it's all happening at one time in this way that I find myself spiraling into. What that means for what I'm working on is I'm in a moment where that's probably it's coherent in the grand scheme of things, but at the same time, I can't say that there's just one kind of project that I'm working on right now or one specific anchor. So bear with me as I ask you all to kind of travel a very messy mind. But by surplus populations, I am thinking through some of Ruthie Gilmore's kind of framings of criminalized people, or what moves to kind of criminalize people. Specifically, I'm thinking about this political context where we have rising anti-immigrant sentiments. We have concerted attacks on critical race theory or the mention of race, and therefore on racialized people and racialized knowledge production. We have transphobia that is mutating, but particularly, through various kind of legal avenues. And we have kind of grand internationally concerted attacks on everyone minoritized by gender, and or seen or understood through disability. So my work applies crip theory to understand kind of the production of the surplus. And I see that as a way that binds efforts to racialize people, efforts to criminalize queer people, etc. And as mentioned, my first book, The Economies of Queer Inclusion, looked at the development of the anti-homosexuality legislation in Uganda, specifically through, this is a while now, 2009 to 2014, when the act was passed and then nullified. It was an ethnographic project that I had conducted during my PhD. And to be honest, I wouldn't say that I had necessarily found queer theory in the kind of, sense that there's a kind of growing sense of there being a canon to queer theory at that point. But I would say, as a queer person with a pretty queer perspective, interacting with queer people, that I found that the theorizing that I kind of moved toward then did queer the questions about what the mechanisms of criminalization were that were impacting everyone, all, Ugandans, whether or not they had particular kind of sexual identity labels that they had adopted. And, I moved to look at the political economic implications, the history and the historical development of the bill, particularly its colonial legacies, but also its manifestations, post-colonial manifestations, and look at the circuits of capital and how they were really impacting the coherence of a community that actually had existed in Uganda long before the bill had created international sensation around that. So I was very interested in kind of what does inclusion do to queer people, included into what, how does that, reshape movement making, et cetera, and then ultimately, what is the impact on rights? And I simultaneously, am an abolitionist community organizer. And so I was bringing in a lot of my perspective about what do queer people of African descent, what are the political claims that don't make it to the most kind of visible realms? And, largely I found that in Uganda, those claims were echoed and yet devalued by an international system of rights. And so that's what that book was about. But my work currently, I've been working on this kind of affective structural continuum from panic to terror, and questioning, how do we use these terms theoretically? So obviously we have moral panics, which sociology, criminology have been concerned with, but we also have terror, which is a central kind of concern of criminology, specifically. My intervention there would be looking at state terror. And I'm curious about kind of what patterns we can look at in the production of, these state terroristic attempts at clamping down on LGBT publics from the origin point of these moral panics. So that's that project's been taking up a lot of space in my mind right now, and it really looks at what does carceral myth-making look like, particularly in the African diaspora, and yeah, so I've been working on a book project that was mentioned, tentatively titled, please don't steal the title, but I'm stealing the title, so it's actually okay. But tentatively, it's titled Abolitionist Archipelagos. And what I'm trying to do is kind of respatialize the way that we think about connected political struggles. And essentially doing that from thinking about kind of carceral cells and the types of thinking that could be moving between the space of imprisonment that's shared by queer people in the African diaspora. So, if that sounds unclear, that's probably because it is. It's, it's messy. It's, in the early thoughts. Well, by early thoughts, I mean, it's been a couple of years and a couple of chapters, you know what I mean? But yeah, so yeah, the broader audit analytics that I'm kind of working with is to advance the idea of colonial carcerality and name and really question where the foundations of criminalization, where we can pinpoint those so that we can kind of come up with better diagnostic and reparative tools for criminalized people in trying to survive the carceral, terror that's happening around the world. So that's where I am. It should become clearer as we get into more questions, but that's my messy first thought.
Thank you. Does that work? Yeah. Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you for organizing. You've been so amazing at it. So I'm Obi. I research maybe at the intersection of queer theory and what people call terrorism studies. And so I kind of try to come with this idea of queer curiosity. What would queer curiosity look like in criminology, in sociology, in anthropology? And that's a very open question. And the reason for that is because my engagement with queer theory was rather retrospective, a bit like you, Rain, what you mentioned earlier, that like queer theory found me rather than I found queer theory. I work with jihadist group members in France, and I do interviews about their romantic and familial relationships and so on. And I do ethnography with them as well. And I guess I was doing something differently, according to colleagues and people I would meet, but I couldn't really put my finger on what it was. And so my whole PhD has been actually kind of like searching for what am I doing, and why do I take that, why do I make these assumptions instead of these other assumptions, and so on. And when I started reading more queer theory, I was like, oh, okay, actually it's coming from this. And then I read crip theory, and I was like, this is the one. So my approach is queer and crip. And yeah, then I write about this thing called queer and crip habitus, how my inhabitation of the world through through these different types of identities shape the work that I do. And I mean, I'm going to try to be as concrete as possible, because I often think that queer theory can feel very fluffy, especially when one is kind of new to it. And then, it's like, okay, I hear a lot of like, joy and utopia and blah, blah, blah. What are we talking about, right? So I work on jihadist group members. And what that means is that the way the jihadist group members are currently being represented, the way they are being thought of, the way they are being felt towards, if that makes sense, is part of a affectual regime, exactly what you've mentioned as well, working on that kind of like affectual regime that makes certain populations being framed one way or another. And that regime, we're carrying it in ourselves as researchers. It's not something that is very impossible to grab. Actually, the way that one feels when one goes to do interviews, the way that your close ones or family members react to when you say, I'm a criminologist working on these people who commit crime or whatever, the way that these people, your family members, are reacting to this, all of it is part of that affectual environment, right? And so when it comes to jihadist group members, since maybe for the last 20 years, there's been a kind of a discourse produced on jihadists, discourse that was with images as well. So if I tell you right now, imagine what I'm working on. I mean, I'm working on jihadist love stories, right? Or jihadist community building, friendship. If I ask you right now, what could I be finding doing these interviews, you might have some ideas coming up to your mind. You might have like, conjugal slavery. You might have, I don't know, domestic violence and so on and so forth. So already these images are in your head already from the press, from all sorts of things. So me, I'm kind of like trying to like take a picture of those images that we all have. And of course, these pictures are many and different from where you speak from, etc. But that's pretty much it. And then I kind of like compare those images, whether it's in academia when it's being produced, in the press, not so much. I don't really study the press, but in the bodies of researchers, my fellow colleagues, the way we frame subjects and so on. And I compare that to what I think is the lived experience of subjects. And I'm interested in that gap, right? And I call that gap the gap in between where the monster lives. This gap is where there's something there that I find quite interesting. How am I with time? Yeah. I guess something that maybe I want to talk about when it comes to queer curiosity and the potential for queer criminology is that there's a radically anti-moralist orientation in queer theory. And that does not mean, rejecting moral reasoning per se, but it's an opening to the multiplicity of moralities. So there's subjective morality, there's, personal morality, and there's all sorts of moralities if we look it up, right? Look it up or research or think or whatever. And so the plural moral economies, it's something I'm really interested in. And so from this angle, when I'm being told about all sorts of stories when jihadist group members tell me about, the way, for instance, one leaves their bio family behind and kind of like dreams of this perfect community in which they will be fulfilled and have all their emotional needs met, being understood, finally fitting in, and so on and so forth. Here, I think the queer curiosity makes me see a rupture from sort of like a moment of hardship to a healing movement that goes towards imagining something else. And that for me is a sort of engagement with rupture, right? And so I think that, like queer theory gives you a lot of tools to kind of like think of rupture and continuity and normativity quite differently, if that makes sense. And another example, because I want to be concrete, is because I work on chosen families in jihadist group members, I guess, communities. And I draw from the fact that queer people and brown people have historically formed kinship outside of like heteronormative families for all sorts of reasons. They were forced to develop horizontal kinships because of these vertical rupture of all sorts. And so when we rethink critically about biofamilies not being that perfect thing, and we cannot think about rupture from biofamilies, something that in the criminal justice system is often seen as something that makes individuals vulnerable to either radicalization or engagement in crime and so on and so forth. So to think critically of the kind of like supremacy of the biofamilial bond in the way we write and in the way we think, I think is very productive. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think that it was really interesting to hear more about like what's in your mind at the moment and what you're working on, and I can already see some overlaps and interesting discussions also emerging from that. I think one thing I personally also sometimes work with or think about, and a question which I actually increasingly get, is this relationship between feminism and queer theory. And how kind of feminist and queer theory and also activism kind of build upon each other, where are the overlaps, where are the fractures. And I wanted to ask you how you have encountered this question in your research and work and how you usually think about it. Anybody would like to start?
You're looking at me expectantly there. Yeah, so thank you for that question. I mean, this question kind of defines my whole academic life, I guess, because I grew up in university through feminism in the 1980s, very long time ago, through radical feminism. So radical feminism to me at the time was something really empowering when I was like 18, 19, 20. And I was reading Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin, and discovering the world like through the eyes of the people that I saw who were incredibly impressive thinkers and doers. And it wasn't until really much later that I discovered queer theory, and I did go looking for it because I felt the gap in feminism. And so my PhD was really about the conversation between two bodies of theory, as I said before. They were kind of sort of talking to each other sometimes, but mostly not. And you had kind of social theory around constructionism and Foucault, and then Butler and all sorts of funky people. And then by this time, Catherine McKinnon was like, nobody liked Catherine McKinnon. She was this person who'd, divided people, made people think that she hated all men, and that to be a feminist you had to hate men. And Andrew Dworkin had said all sex was rape, and all this is terrible. So I was kind of like, okay, that's a very dramatic portrayal. But there were some people who did actually think along those lines, and I felt like my job was to kind of rescue that a little bit and try and bring some of the critiques of those theorists back into a more radical moment in conversation with queer theory. In 2008, I don't know if many of you know Janet Halley's book, Split Decisions, How and When to Take a Break from Feminism, which totally blew my head off in 2008. It was really controversial when it came out. Such a good, interesting book. Definitely recommend it if you haven't read it. And Halley's argument basically is that feminism thinks it owns conversations about gender, sex, and sexuality, and it doesn't. And it really needs to, not only does feminism need to make space for other theories, like queer theory, other theories that are not focusing on basically patriarchy. We need to stop reading feminism. Just put all the feminist books down. And the way that she writes the book is really entertaining. It's extremely accessible. It really draws you in. And she keeps saying things like, I'm failing at my own mission because all I've done for this book is read feminism, but I want you to put the feminism down for a bit and read other stuff. And that was a real challenge to me at the time. I remember thinking, what would I do without feminism? But she's really clear also about saying it's not about throwing it out of the window. It's about just thinking through other lenses for a bit and then maybe trying to find ways to bring them together. So I think the challenge of doing that is particularly present and obvious in this particular moment around trans rights, where the media often likes to portray feminism and support for trans communities as being in opposition to each other, which is, of course, we know is not the case. But there are some feminists who do argue in ways that make trans lives impossible. So there is a division there. So it is a really interesting and very, very difficult moment, theoretically, politically, practically, to think about how feminism and other theories, including theories around gender, and how gender is always hierarchized racially through class, through ableism, and how those insights have been lost in the feminist conversation around what is the meaning of sex, what is the meaning of gender, because they get reduced to their lowest common denominator of chromosomes or wearing skirts, and it's just not. We've lost all nuance in that conversation. So, taking maybe going back to Janet Halley's call to not call to arms, but her invocation of that metaphor of go to some other shelves in the library and borrow some other books and read some other stuff, and it will help us the book also talks about fragmented theory. You don't have to have one. We all know this is an insight of postmodernism. You don't have to have one theory that explains everything. But she very beautifully describes her approach to being not inside a theory, but being inside a problem. And then using being inside the problem to understand how theory can work for you inside that problem.
Thank you for that. I think, it's funny because, this isn't coordinated at all. But no, what that response makes me think of is, or I think it's actually a decent segue to what I would have said, which is, I came to queer theory quite deliberately as well, but the entry point was entirely different. And I think the political project in a lot of ways is very different for the queer theory that I engage, which may not even recognizably be queer theory. That's why I mentioned that kind of development of a canon that feels that I was trained outside of. So some of the scholars that I feel most indebted to are thinkers who are on a mission to Africanize queer, like that term in and of itself, but also theory. And I feel really grateful to be kind of learning with some people in that project. I would right now name SN Niek as one of them. But in that, I don't see feminism or queer theory, but also I would say the politic as one that is distinct, as in, or sorry, two that are distinct and antagonistic projects in the ways that I think that current politics, particularly on this island, would want us to think, right? And so, one, the kind of anti-trans lobby, or people who are even being called, TERFs or trans exclusionary radical feminists. I mean, first of all, there's no radical feminism to be found within that politic, but second of all, they are actually quite a small minority of feminists in even this, kind of cultural context. And yet there's a lot of power and there's a lot of economic backing that's supporting that political project. And so for me, part of what I want to do, what I think to do, and what I believe that the project of Africanizing queer does for me and my work is it provides a bridge through which we can understand that being minoritized by gender is not something that's attributed to a specific understanding of biological sex. It's not, and I would say somebody who probably is attributed as being quite a canonical figure within queer theory, Kathy Cohen, made this argument, gosh, I guess now it's about 2 decades ago. But with punks, bull daggers, and welfare queens, thinking about queer theory as this project that connects us specifically because it can name gender oppressions as one that that actually supersedes by readings and understandings of biological sex onto how it's a racialized project, how it is a project that is one that is a colonial project. It's an economic project. It is a project that actually stifles political dissent. And so what is queer is what connects us against these forms of harm. And so, you'll hear and have heard me say those minoritized by gender, because I want to point out gender as a social ordering, right? A mechanism for social ordering rather than an interpretation of one's particular expressions or of or biological sex, which we would need an entirely different panel amount of time to break down. But so, you know, within this project of Africanizing queer, and I would add reference to Ifya Madiumi, Wando Achebe, you know, a number of really amazing theorists who disassociate sexuality from the queer project in many ways. And that's not to say that sex and sexuality don't enter the conversation, but there's so many ways to experience sex and sexuality that actually all fit within queer. And one entry point, one kind of vector of understanding is understanding how colonialism and coloniality is impacting the African continent, but all of us who are descended from African peoples. Which is to say that this idea of deviant sexuality applies to all of those imagined as excess. And it's within that excessiveness, within that kind of wantonness, that lack of civility, et cetera, that specific colonial project that then puts on gender oppression and gendered readings, gender as an aspiration onto people, right? And decolonial feminism in many ways is, I mean, it's always been a queer project. So Maria Lugones, who may break down for us this kind of idea of the dark and light sides of coloniality and the way the coloniality of gender actually works to oppress not just racialized people, but people here, you know, who descend from people on this island. So all to say that for me, I actually make a point not to disentangle these conversations. You know, there's queer and there's feminist, but then there's race, but then there's disabled, but then there's, that doesn't make sense to me. And I think, you know, point of reference probably impacts that quite a lot. But in this moment where we're being attacked from so many different fronts, I think that it serves all of those against us to kind of imagine that our political response will be successful in any way, shape, or form through like continuing to silo a politic. It doesn't work that way. So, you know, to a certain extent, you know, trans theory is one that often is pushed outside of queer theory, and queer theory is pushed outside of feminist theory, and feminist theory is pushed. And genuinely, I refuse that in the work that I do, both, you know, within organizations, but also within my writing.
Yeah, thank you, SM. Yeah, I feel like, you know, drawing on what you just said, I feel like there's a sort of advantage, or at least we are pushed towards building these walls, and that makes us, you know, like that makes queer theorists kind of like exaggerate those rupture, I think, as a way of you know, providing newness and so on and so forth. And it goes, you know, like the whole publish or perish and everything. There's a logic by which we are almost obliged to differentiate excessively in order to make a point, which I find quite unproductive and rather, yeah, silly. But if I were to to think a little bit about the kind of like frictions between feminist theory and queer theory, well, I would just start by saying that feminist theory is so plural that I wouldn't dare to kind of like put it under one kind of category. But with that being said, I found I found some stuff in queer theory that I found nowhere else. Well, I found it in both crip, race critical, and queer theory. A sort of embracing of ambivalence and contradiction, and of course failure. We've talked a bit about that. That I find particularly interesting. I think there's even a sort of like queer nihilism that I'm particularly drawn to as a criminologist, because criminology is so invested, or so it's full of these kind of like moral rules of the good and the bad, and I think that sometimes feminist scholarship tends to kind of like go into that logic of the good and the bad, displacing the bad always towards a new kind of population. I think that there's something very freeing in the playfulness of queer theory, and often when I say playfulness, I've been the object or subject. I don't know. I've been the object of a shitstorm on the web recently, where there was like, it was like some kind of like Trump people, whatever, you know those. They were really, really upset at my research, and why they were upset was because I talked about playfulness next to jihadism, and that really, like, it was like, it's very serious. People are dying, and I was like, I was there, like, and like, if you twist and turn and BDSM and blah 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 and playfulness, and they were not having it. And generally speaking, I mean, I am provocative and I use provocation sometimes, but there's nothing more serious than playfulness in some ways, because it's a plasticity two categories. It's a flexibility of many things that resists categorization, resists normative, like strict rules and so on and so forth. And I find that there's something in queer theory when I read it that's that emancipates itself so radically from kind of like moralist perspectives, in a way that, like, yeah, brings a lot of discomfort if one is bathed in all sorts of like rigid understanding of the right and the wrong. And I'm just like, I'm there for it, absolutely. I want to push it to the max, and yeah, I think it's super productive. Yeah.
So I just want to jump in there and say that I think that that aspect of what you're calling playfulness is, again, something that's been a bit kind of lost because of the political terrain that we're in right now. It's almost impossible. You've got one example, there's a lot of examples, like it's impossible. I have a fantastic graduate student who's working on queer suffering and how it's become the main sort of currency of conversation is the suffering part. And so one of the things that she's done in fieldwork is gone to queer comedy clubs and is immersing themselves in essentially joy. Like, what does joy look like even through moments of suffering? So I think that aspect of our understanding of queer as I think Butler once said something like, laughter in the face of categories is indispensable for feminism. Like that sense of like pushing back through, not through rights and not through, but through something like playfulness or joy or laughter is has been lost in this political moment.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think you also gave me really good ideas about how to think about like feminism and queer theory together. I'm always a bit ambivalent regarding Janet Haley's book because I really like it. It's great. And I think the title, just taking a break from feminism, always like has this, raises this ambivalent feelings in me, because I feel like, shall we take a break at this current moment from feminism, or shall we just show the plurality of feminisms which exist out there? Anyway, let's move on to a question regarding methodology. So some of the aspects I'm interested in have been already a bit responded to, but I wanted to specifically raise this question of how you understand queer criminology and queer criminal justice studies informed by global relations of race and religion, disability and class, or other axes of inequality. And then another question methodology we are interested in is how one does queer research, or how queerness of the researcher or participants shapes our research, and what insights we can draw from doing research queerly. So yeah, feel free to just explore any of these questions in your answers. You like to start?
Yeah, I love this question. That's why I wanted to start. yeah, I feel like the practice of doing queer theory in criminology or elsewhere is really where queer theory flourishes the most for me. So I work on, so I do these interviews, right, and these ethnographic, I don't know, terrain, I don't know, yeah, work. And so I've been using BDSM consent practices in interviews, and I wrote an article about it. And same people were like, yeah, it's not good, BDSM. But like, what actually is happening is that the BDSM thing found me rather than I found it again. I feel like with the queer habitus, my particular queer habitus is being a white person in a European town with a bunch of queer people that look like me, and I have a certain way of speaking and asking questions and so on that's just like engraved in my brain, something I can't kind of like get out of. And I feel like all of us bring our own habitus, right? And I think with the BDSM consent rules, I don't know if that's your feeling, but encountering the way that we are taught to do interviews versus what feels like you should be, how delicate one should be when doing interviews, for instance. It's just like that thing kind of like stayed with me so much, like the contrast. And I think that, so just to tell you a bit more about this BDSM thing, because I invite everyone to find their own way of doing interviews and what feels the best for them, and for protecting both like the agency of participants as well as their protecting and caring for participants. So I do a negotiation of boundaries before the interviews. So I ask also about whether someone has already practiced being talked to in that way. And I feel like it's very important to do so in criminology when working with people that have been often the object or subject of police interrogation, criminal justice system loops. And often if I ask, have you been interviewed before? People tell me, oh yeah, I've been interrogated a bunch of times. And that's really, really important knowledge when you enter an interview room. And so like after the negotiation of boundaries, that meant like, where are we not going today? What is a red zone? And I feel like doing that made me, well, of course, like feel closer to participants and maybe made participants feel safer perhaps. But there was also this element where, like one would say this bad sexual experience where someone crossed my boundaries is absolutely not out of line. I would love to talk about it. But this spiritual thing that happened to me on that moment, I cannot talk about it. I will not talk about it. And I don't want it to be written anywhere. That's not intuitive to me, right? So so I've found out that actually asking for like places we can go and places we can't go is very useful. Then there's safe words that we establish together. Like any constellation out there, it's often like fruit names. It's all about the pineapple code word and all of that. I found it really useful to kind of like, we talked a bit about refusing research. I mean, there's something to like putting down the feminist thing. That there's also Tuck and Wong who talk about refusing research. But as researchers, methodologically, we have to convey some tools for people to refuse research, particularly when the power imbalance between researchers and participants is sometimes so big, particularly for the participants I work with as a white researcher and them who are racialized as Muslims. And then they can be of different race, but still there's this huge dynamic. And so to actually concretely think of tools to enact or to allow people to enact refusal, I find it very important. And that's where I think the queer creativity is the most useful. And also we do safe gesture. And I think that's also really interesting just because, of course, this whole queer thing, hello, we're doing safe word, we're doing this, we're doing that. It can create a big distance as well from participants for all sorts of reasons. It can be a new jargon that feels completely alienating. You know, things that feel natural, non-verbal cues and so on and so forth. You know, consent doesn't have to look like you're in a queer sex club where everybody is, you know, like knows all the rules in such a specific way and so on and so forth. So yeah, thinking through the practice of queerness, of maybe like just like an ethics of treating people the way you would treat your community. And by community, I mean the people you interact with, right? I think that's something that speaks to me a lot, at least. Yeah.
Methodologically, okay, so I think to go back to what I was saying about queer, so one thing that I've always loved and appreciated about the term queer and the project of reclaiming queer as a community is how it served to connect so many people who have specific identity labels, kind of despite those identity labels, and people who didn't necessarily have those identity labels, but shared a political project, right? So I love queer because for me, the underlying kind of value of that is connection. And when I wrote The Economies of Queer Inclusion, I spent a good deal of time on what ended up becoming the preface, but which was titled A Methodology of Connection. And that was my attempt at thinking through how, if I kind of meditate with connection as a term, what does that do to the ethnography? What does that do to my understanding of law? What does that do to how I interact with or interview people? And what does that do to how I write this up? And so I spent a lot of time developing a methodology of connection so that I could understand and combat the project that was happening globally to condemn Uganda for putting together anti-homosexuality laws. What it inspired me to do was note what is the root of the law itself. So, of course, yes, colonial laws, we understand, had been done, sure. But what was happening was when the anti-homosexuality bill was announced, condemnations rippled around the world, and in this way that really played on the kind of, you know, savage, barbaric, backwards, you know, et cetera, like this idea, right? Everything that we've, of course, come to understand through Puara as homo nationalism. But this rhetoric really spiraled in this way to distance the quote unquote us from them, whoever the us is and whoever the them is. But we understand that this is a racialized project that really needed to be complicated. It really, at minimum, but you know, it needed to be interrogated. And what I saw for that was the root of it was disconnection, but it's a very lazy disconnection, right? One, because it severs the law itself, right, which would not exist without British colonialism. But it also erased the history of developing that legislation in times when the UK or the US would not have condemned it, right? And so it just erased decades of growing that legislation in connection to US and UK politics. And there are many elements. I, take apart that law. I've dedicated far too much time to that, but there are elements of that legislation that was kind of written off as, oh, you know, what a disgusting and inconceivable piece of work, but actually was completely borrowed by or from the UK or from US law in a contemporary sense. So promotion of homosexuality, for example, is of course something that the UK put together, and you know, is very hush hush to a sense that people don't even understand promotion of homosexuality to have existed before Uganda said in 2009. But aggravated homosexuality is borrowed from aggravated rape. And this way of, you know, attributing kind of far greater punishments into kind of certain certain forms of rape, right? Certain, if it hits certain categories in the US, right? And so this carceral response, this bloodthirst, this, you know, the witch hunt, quote unquote, like all of these terms that were used are not used to evaluate self on this state level, but only to distance, to sanction, to harm, etc., in ways that have to be understood by criminologists as carcerality, global carcerality. Okay, so I'm very interested in that, and understanding these kind of connections between these laws and how this legislation was developed was really important to me as someone who you know, is queer, but also of African descent, from places that also have very recent histories of criminalizing homosexuality. And so methodology of connection kind of forced me into really actively identifying these connective roots. But it also led me to identify, you know, where are the disconnections and at what times are people kind of strategically disconnecting? So who is the us in this project? And who is the them? And how is that shaped depending on interaction? You know, so there are times where globally queer people will say, this is, you know, it's us. And they mean queer people in other countries that they don't know. Sometimes it's only us is like just white people, and then there's a them. But you know, all to say this was it, like the us and them. The disconnections were leveraged in really interesting ways and times, and I think that forcing that type of introspection on myself was really important about when do I identify with and how can I do that in a way that serves this project better, research project. So, you know, in times that also meant that I was striving for connection with people who, you know, absolutely very likely would want to hurt me. Like, you know, just, and I had to name that, but also if I try and connect ideologically with them, I can point out where are we disconnecting ideologically, right? And in that way, that gap that maybe is produced, that then kind of inspires this monster, this punitive response in which harm and vengeance and violence comes about. And so for me, this I think it was a queer methodology. But it, you know, it's a queer methodology in that I really just want to create a connective politic instead of dismissing people all the time, which is what I felt got us into this mess in the first place, is a kind of global dismissiveness. So yeah, so I will say that for me is a way that queer theorizing, queer thinking can apply to methodology. I also will say my more recent work, so particularly with abolitionist archipelagos, I am looking through kind of more legal statements, affidavits, etc., for incarcerated people. But I also rely on archives a lot because I am kind of disturbing time quite a bit in the work. It's disorienting. It's going to be, and I hope everyone is disoriented when you read it, but in a good way. Like, you know, wow, that roller coaster made me nauseous, but I want to go back. That kind of vibe. So I have been using kind of more critical fabulation for that, which as a term is developed by Sadia Hartman. And I would say that that has meant me looking at the archive, which I think is very difficult in queer research projects, but particularly when your subject is Black and queer, because there are several forms of erasure that happen and kind of just disappearances that happen. So there are a lot of kind of gaps that one must fill through other archival documents, but as well as, you know, conversations that you can only piece together in a really messy way. And I find that mess really generative. I find that really interesting. But obviously incarcerated trans people are disappeared from the record in many ways through kind of institutional dead naming practices, through just not recognizing people as trans, you know, through a lot of kind of, yeah, many methods. And similarly, once we go back, depending on the time that I'm engaging, you suffer kind of similar gaps when it comes to the enslaved or African archive, with names and, you know, misrecognition, et cetera, et cetera. So I find that, you know, critical fabulation, even though it's not actually maybe imagined as a queer method, it is for me. And the interventions that I'm making methodologically are very much contending with what does queerness and transness look in these times and spaces from behind these cells.
They were both such beautiful responses. I'm not quite sure what to say, but I just that critical fabulation that you were talking about at the end there is something that I've just written a funding proposal for a project that would engage with that literature around social movements and archives between the 1950s and now, in what I'm calling in the shadow of law. So what's happening around sex and gender, since gender became a term that law started to use in the 1950s, what's happened to how can I map the legal journey of these things, but what's happening in the shadow of law? So also going into archives, feminist archives, LGBTQ archives, trans archives, queer museums and galleries, archives and stuff, to try to make sense of something else you said earlier about the stories that aren't told, that and then you said so beautifully there, the kind of multiple erasures that take place. So even where you think of looking is such an important question, and how you position yourself in relation to that material. Again, this is all sort of future, that hopefully happening in the future, hopefully funded, but like that's what I'm really sort of starting to get immersed in that, which I find so incredibly powerful. I would also say that the piece of work that I did with two other colleagues, when we started off from a criminal justice perspective, looking at how women's claims of rapes were treated in the criminal justice system, and we wanted to know whether they were treated in a similar way in the asylum system. And of course, what you find there is that people's experiences of storytelling and the assessment of the credibility of those stories in the asylum context is totally permeated with mostly racist and nationalist assumptions about what stories should look like. So if you don't tell a story in this way, then it's not true. Women from the DRC never are upfront about telling you everything. So if you haven't told the Home Office at the first available opportunity that you were sexually assaulted, then you're clearly not lying, because they just tell you everything. And all of those, what was really interesting about talking to people inside the asylum system was realizing that gender gender was a massive part, obviously, of both their story and their lived experience of being a home traveling in the UK, but so permeated by all of these other hierarchizing, disabling mechanisms that women would often, that we saw, would often choose silence as an agentic action. I'm not going to participate in your demand for me to tell you a story in this way. And that was really, I mean, very, again, powerful to watch that idea that the system itself, in demanding a story and in demanding it in certain ways, is setting you up to fail. So the refusal and the resistance involved in that was incredible. So I've forgotten now why I wanted to I wanted to say that, but I wanted to say that. But yeah, how you position yourself in relation to not just the problem, but also the people, the actual humans involved in the research that you're doing, and reflect on that, it completely changes the way that your research then evolves, I think.
Yeah, thank you so much. So what I would suggest now is to do a 10 minutes break. Afterwards, we will come back and I have one more question and then we will start the audience interaction. We will plan to finish at 4:30. So we have like a good hour, but let's first take a 10 minutes break with some coffee. Hello. So I would like to, we have about an hour, a bit less left. So as I mentioned before, there's one more question which I would like to just ask our guests, and then you're all asked also to share some of your questions. Some of the issues which were raised already today pose the question of like, what's next, kind of, or how do we deal with criminal justice, criminology as such? So is it worth considering a reformist approach to criminology, criminal justice, the system which is set up? Is it worth trying to engage to reform, or is kind of any reform doomed to fail as such? And secondly, what's the role of universities here? So what can we draw from queer approaches to think about our disciplines, our academic institutions, our classrooms? What does it mean to engage in academia in a queerly manner? And what are some of the positive aspects as well, which we can draw from queer theory for our teaching and researching? So yeah, broad, very large questions to you.
I think I'm the only one that hasn't gone first yet. Okay, so about, oh, am I just really loud? That's great. I love that.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. I am really loud. I didn't realize. So I think, you know, in terms of the reform, and it sounds like maybe a question about the salvageability of criminal justice. Okay, so I will start with the position that I am an abolitionist. I think of, so I think many societies are structured in such a way that criminality is a meta language, right? As in there are those of us who cannot interact with society or law without that idea of whether or not we are a criminal, right? Our bodies being read or interpreted as criminalized subjects, impacting the accessibility of rights or you know, of the law, right? The various kind of mechanisms of citizenship that many other people have access to. Now, I don't necessarily think that every society works this way, but I have experienced many through which queerness does kind of put you through that trajectory. And I've experienced where Blackness puts you in that trajectory. And I would say, you know, most probably work where queer Blackness is through that. So I don't actually, I don't actually think that there is something to or worth saving about criminal justice. I think that criminalization is a technology of coloniality, and I think that there are many you know, utopias, to maybe John Rain's opening, that exist without this. Now, at the same time, abolitionist theory has, of course, and I think abolitionist organizing has reformulated this question so that it's not so binary, in that, you know, so Ruthie Gilmore, for example, has written a lot on reformist reforms and non-reformist reforms. So the distinction being that reform for reform's sake will reconstitute an institution that is meant to hurt certain people. Like that is what the institution itself was designed to do. Criminalization has it was shaped in order to traffic people from this island to various colonies around the world, but also people for the purposes of enslavement, servitude, etc., to reconstitute the power of colonial centers. I don't believe that anything that makes that project better is worth saving or doing. Simultaneously, there are non-reformist reforms, right, which the delineation is that which serves to reform and make a better and stronger institution would be a reformist reform, and that which seeks harm reductionist routes in order to make sure that we are, you know, that there's some mitigation of the harmful effects of an institution that is current, with the aim that it actually weakens the institution. So it narrows the carceral net, right? It narrows the scope of violence that people can experience. It narrows the populations that can be targeted, or maybe the technologies through which populations may be targeted, etc. Now, that's just to nuance the conversation about what reform is and what reform does and the possibility of it. And it is really important, I think, for those of us who, so my history of organizing is as, you know, in a queer of color organization that seeks to address violence happening to the queer community without inviting violence. So how do we respond to violence without imparting our own violence interpersonally, supporting cultures of violence, or calling in the police, right, as understood as agents of structural violence. And that, for me, is a really important baseline, because what it means is, you know, I've been in many situations where I've had to make daily calls about you know, emergency situations where you have to determine how do you respond and what is the end or the trajectory that you're likely to put yourself in position for based on the decision you're making right now. What that does is it widens like how many responses we think are available to us when harm is happening. And what carcerality does is it limits how many responses we believe are available. So if we, you know, so if I am in a moment of engaging a kind of, you know, an instance of sexual violence, right? Now in life, we know I think, especially as queer people, that sexual violence is very rarely treated seriously through criminal justice. So, and simultaneously, we know that criminal justice is maintained through mythologies of sexual violence, right? So rape is only paired with murder for rationale for why prisons should exist, right? Like into perpetuity, because what about the rapists and the murderers? At the same time, those of us who have experienced rape have known that actually, one, most people who commit this specific type of harm do not find themselves anywhere near a prison. And yet society is not meant, you know, I like the idea that it's going to fall or function or what. Right. So we can think about what do we do now to reform this, right? Which might be making sure more rapists go to prison. You see, that strengthens the prison as a site, reconstitutes our imagination that the prison is the only way to deal with, or the best way to deal with this particular type of harm. And simultaneously, it widens the net through which mostly poor people, people of color, and immigrants will be ensnared, right? And leave the people who actually have access to committing the most harm, sexual violence, completely free to run countries and, you know, whatnot. I won't name any particular ones right now. So with that being said, what abolition does is it actually expands our recognitive resources, right? We can think about so many other ways to respond to sexual violence if we lean on abolition, because you have to be creative, right? Because the institutions have to democratize, because you have to actually attend to how this harm happened, why it happened, and what we can do to make sure that we're supporting the person who has been harmed, right? Abolition is what allows us to do that, not reform. And so for me, the reason why I think about and try and, you know, complicate the picture is because you have to make a real life, real time decision about what do you do to ensure the safety of someone right now. But you also have to contend with all of the failures of the system that happen, and the idea of, well, what if it's more successful? Like, what happens at the end if we reform this institution so that it can be more successful? Does that success actually build a future of less harm or not? And for me, the answer is no.
Thank you for such an interesting answer. Abolition is not my topic as such. But what I do think is that the queer movement in academia necessarily foregrounds ambiguity, repair, refusal, all sorts of things that necessarily unsettle certain assumptions on which the criminal justice system is based. And so right now, for instance, I'm working on a book about trauma. Same as SM. Don't steal this book because it's not written yet. So I would be so sad if someone writes it so fast, right? So annoying. Yeah, I would be so sad, you guys. But the book is or will be about maybe like something about trauma revolution or something like that, and how from a crip theory perspective and from a queer theory perspective, you know, what holds then in the criminal justice system and in the way we I don't know who apprehend perpetrators of violence, because I think crip theory unsettles so much that there's no hold anymore. with crip theory. And I do believe that there's also something about queer theory and its relationship to non-normative temporality that's an invitation to rethink what violence is, beyond the subject and beyond a limited time frame. I think queer theory is inviting us to think of systems of harms, environment of harms, and intergenerational harm. And it's not only queer theory that does that, it's crip theory and race critical theory. These three, I think, do it so well that it's almost like the tenets of the criminal justice system as it exists in the UK, in France, for what I know, and elsewhere, are untenable. Like it cannot exist anymore with like theoretically, they just hold so many tools to kind of, especially crip theory. I mean, for me, crip theory comes with so much understanding of the body from within that it unsettles a lot. Yeah. So I'll keep you posted about this book that shall write itself.
Thank you. I'm not writing a book right now, so nothing to see here, nothing to steal. Maybe if I get the grant, yeah. So I think I touched earlier on like this project that I did last year with the Scottish Government, which was about trying to make things better for complainers when they report rape, and I can see that pulls in two different directions. It could be a non-reformist reform project where you're actually just trying to make sure that people are not traumatized by the system itself when they enter into it, but with the goal of creating more conversations about what is harm and how do we deal with harm. Or it could just be, these projects are often framed in these terms, it's about best evidence, getting the person who's been harmed to give their best evidence so that they can maximize the chances of a conviction, right? So depending on how you frame that kind of a project, determines how much existential angst you have. And I had quite a lot of existential angst about doing that project. And I did say afterwards, I won't do that again. I know this is being recorded. But I did say I wouldn't do that again, partly because I also, just from the practical point of view of methodologically, practically, ethically, and psychologically, having to go through the Scottish Government's research protocols, so not being able to actually directly engage with the people that you want to work with, was just a complete nightmare. So like there are lots of reasons to do those kinds of projects because people are harmed by the system, and there must be ways of trying to undo that without adding to the overall goal of like raising convictions and so on. But it is a really fine line to walk, and it's not comfortable. With them, the challenges for creating space for queer approaches to justice, I do find this actually really challenging because I still think there's so much resistance in so many different places to even sometimes the word queer still. And I don't even just mean just generally in society. I mean, our Staff Pride network has voted twice on their name and both times rejected to include the Q in the name because there are people in the community who just don't feel that is a letter that represents them, or it's got a history of trauma and denigration that doesn't sit easily with them. So they don't want that to be part of their identity, part of their public communication with the university community. And so actually, I often find myself still having conversations with people, students or colleagues or even family members. What actually is queer? What does it mean? What does it add? What does it bring to the table? Does it bring anything to the table beyond kind of like watching the L Word, which we were talking about earlier, or, you know, queer eye for the straight guy or whatever. Like, what work is it actually doing for us, if any? And I think there are still people who would use it interchangeably. This is not criticism, it's just an observation. People use it interchangeably with LGBT plus or LGBTQI plus or whatever. And so sometimes I think the nuance or the sharp pointy bits of queer get a bit lost again in the conversation. So I think it's hard anyway. And then you add in the toxicity of this moment, and then it becomes just a messy kind of mush of like, we're just doing our best here, going along, trying to do one conversation at a time, maybe sometimes, to try to make space for queer approaches to justice, but also queer approaches in the academy, in the classroom, and not still have that feeling, which I do, that it's still an outsider perspective. It's an outsider kind of methodology or set of practices. So I'm usually optimistic, so I'm going to try and end on an optimistic note and say that I think there is hope, if it's queer radical hope rather than kind of the hope of reform or the hope of sewing things together into neat, pretty whole tapestry. And it's not hope for, certainly from my perspective, it's not hope for law. That's not what I hope for, more law. But I do want to say that I think there are always spaces for things. If you look hard enough, there is always spaces. So.
Thank you so much. Before handing over to Arushi for the audience interaction as well, I just wanted to say that I think one reason why we also did this event today is actually like to create community as one way also to think about queer approaches to justice, let's say, in a different way outside of like law, for example. And because I think a lot of us, we are also working isolated in different disciplines. So it's important to kind of start the conversations, bring people together. But I now will hand over to Arushi.
Okay, yeah.